you can put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It's not going to do anything. You can fix this only to encounter it again a year from now in a different kind of way. You're just rebranding dysfunction.
Katherine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
It's really a joy to have the conversation with you as well. This subject matter of perfectionism is deeply personal for me. So I'm excited to double click on this subject and we'll take a deep dive together. But I'd love to start with some of your origin story, Katherine. I know you're a well-respected psychotherapist, but this got me. You were the corporate therapist at Google. Run me through some of your story. I'm fascinated.
So I have always known I wanted to be a therapist. It's a strange job for a kid to know that they want to be. But I was really lucky before my career started, before I even graduated high school. And I'm going to dive into this because sometimes creative people, and this will make sense when I finish my story, find their work to be frivolous in some way, artists, poets. And this moment that I had changed the course of my life. So I'm in like 7th or 8th grade and we're learning about haikus. And I'm reading this haiku about geese that fly in a V formation. And I've never been able to find this haiku. It would mean so much to me to ever find it. But anyway, I read this poem and the poet is like, and if you look up at the sky when geese are flying that way, there's nowhere else those birds are meant to be. It's so beautiful, and he or she was so moved by it. And when I read that, I was like, oh, that's what I'm going to do for my job. I'm going to make people feel like there's nowhere else they need to be other than right where they are. And it wasn't a like, oh, I hope I get to do that. I want to do that. It was a knowing. It was this really deep moment of lucidity where I was like, I'm going to do that. And so being a therapist was like a very natural fit for that. But if I think about it a lot, like if I were born in a different time or I, came up in a different circumstance, that's the intention behind everything that I do, is to just help people feel present with where they are and who they are. And so I graduated, got my degree in psychology, did research, went into social work at 22. I worked in residential treatment with kids who were wards of the state of California, which means they, had come from abuse and neglect and they had cycled through foster homes and were now in the care of the state. So that was really a crash course in everything that a counselor has to, the curriculum of this work, of like boundaries, self-care. It's really easy to burn out in social work. And I knew I wanted to go into private practice. And so I went to grad school in New York, started my practice, and I didn't know how to start my practice. So I just went. Do you know One Medical? That it's like a medical suite that is supposed to be changing the game and being a disruptor in medical treatment so that you're not waiting in long lines and having confusing insurance stuff. I presented to all these doctors and GPs, and I was like, listen, I'm just starting out, but if you refer someone to me, I will stay with them until they find the right person if I'm not the right person for them. And here's all the resources that I know in the city. And so, I was talking to GPs about how they're often the first contact of someone being like, I can't sleep. And they're not going to go to a therapist yet. But if their doctor says, well, how are you feeling? Well, what's going on? It's such a rushed system that doesn't happen. Anyway, so I gave those talks, and I also talked at these programs called employment assistant programs. And every big company, Google, Apple, big law firms, Deutsche Bank, all the big kind of headquarter places work with EAPs so that they can coordinate their human resources team and help everyone get support. And so I worked with an EAP that placed me on site at Google for, during a pilot program about whether Google employees would benefit from 10 sessions of therapy, on Google's dime, basically. So that's how the Google thing happened. And in the midst of that, I still ran my private practice and I started creating a blog, and I got really into the public health kind of aspect of talking about mental health in a way that, the most people possible could hear, because you're confined, unlike your podcast with millions and millions of listeners, right? I have, at max 30, 35 people a week. And so I started to feel really frustrated with that and tried to cast a wide net. And that's also where this book was born. The Perfectionist Guide to Losing Control was about, me trying to connect with people about these themes that I kept encountering, whether I was working with abused children or, I used to have a practice on Wall Street. That was interesting. Wow. Super high achievers at Google, wherever. Like, it's actually all the same stuff.
What's the same? Okay, this is really fascinating to me, because I hear you work with children and vulnerable populations of people, and then you're in Wall Street and you're at Google. If there's a common thread, a pain point, a shared experience that you notice through this, I'd like to, number one, propose that it affects people not only in their beliefs but in their core of their identity. I am fundamentally and fatally flawed could be the subconscious narrative that runs through many. What would that theme be, or what did you notice that theme to be, from vulnerable children to Wall Street?
It's connection.
Wow.
It's relational wealth. And that is a term coined by psychiatrist Dr. Bruce Perry, who says, and his research is incredible and thorough and brilliant, that the greatest predictor of mental health is your relational health, the quality of the connections in your life. And all of that really comes down to another professional hero of mine from way back in the day, like Freud's day. Dr. Alfred Adler said, connection comes down to one question, especially for kids, which is, do you feel that you have one trusted human being in the world? And that's all you need. All you need is one. And if you can go to one person and know there's nothing I can lay at this person's lap that's going to make them run from me. They love me, they accept me, they want good things for me. And if you don't know that, you just contract. And if you do know that, you expand. And so, that lesson was on steroids, working with these foster kids and wards of the state who really did not know that, who did not have that secure attachment to anybody. And you don't have to come from a history of abuse, though, to encounter that feeling of disconnection. So I also encountered it a lot on Wall Street and at Google, because when you achieve at a certain level, a part of your mind is like, do people only like me because I have a lot of money? Do people only like me because I'm at Google and this is, a cool job or whatever? And so it just becomes this insecurity, but it all is about connection and relational wealth.
I once heard that every relationship in our lives is either moving toward connection or toward disconnection, stability or instability. Then what do you think, if you could put language to a common insecurity, then what do you think that might be?
I think it would probably be if someone knew who I really was, they wouldn't like me or love me. Or if someone, it's what you were talking about before and what I've heard you talk about in all of these podcasts that I've been binging of yours, which is,
Wow.
which is like nobody's inoculated from the universal experience of questioning oneself, feeling insecure, wondering like, am I good enough?
Yeah.
Am I worthy of love, connection, joy? I mean, joy is a big one. Joy is a big one. That we don't really give ourselves a lot of permission to feel until other people around us are happy, or, you know, the problems of the world are solved or whatever. We attach so much guilt to feeling good too, not just feeling bad.
Do you think a lot of that fuels the performance addiction that so many people today are trapped by? Like, we've been on the hamster wheel for so long that we wouldn't recognize Monday through Friday without it. And now we are slave to this thing called performance, just so I can find this pseudo sense of connection in relationships that are surfacey at best.
Yes, that's what it is. It's a pseudo sense of connection, and it feels so close to connection, and that's why it's dangerous. Because it feels like you're doing something, you're busy, you're moving a lot, you're progressing in a way, but it's like, but who is progressing? Are you progressing, or is like the small, tiny reductionist part of you that's on your resume progressing, you know? And I think people get lost. I mean, I certainly do. I don't know anyone who doesn't. And it's really confusing. And that's why we need connections to keep us tethered. But the more you're on this performance track, and particularly for high achieving people, that there's no crisis. And the blessing of a crisis is that it's a call to action. Like, something is wrong and you need to take immediate reparative measures to fix it. But when you're on that performance track, as you're talking about, it's like maybe nothing seems wrong and maybe everything seems even right. You're getting a raise, or you got, you know, 1 million more listeners or whatever. And now you have sponsors or whatever it is, whatever your metrics are. But it's like, but are you in the moment? Are you actually enjoying your life? Do you feel like you have, as Dr. Alfred Adler says, one trusted person? You know?
Wow. We're taking this thing deep already, and I love it.
I love it. You don't have a capacity to not be deep. I've listened to you. Small talk is not for you.
No, it's not at all. I grew up in the household of 2 professional counselors. So
Oh, you did?
one of my favorite questions to ask people is, what I heard you, rather, I like to reflect. What I heard you say is this, and then like, tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more.
I love tell me more. And also, I wonder. I wonder is like what you preface to someone when you want to tell them what to do, but you can't tell them what to do. And you're like, I wonder what would happen if you stopped doing that for a week.
Oh, shoot. We're going to get there because of the topic center of today's conversation. But I want to stick on something for a moment because we can't move past this too quickly. Essentially, you said we should never waste a good crisis. What's that about?
Well, I mean, a crisis is it demands reflection. It's a moment of reflection, and the way I describe it in the book is like we all lose control over and over again, and we have basically 2 choices. We can either scramble to try and restructure all the control that we had that was illusory and is not real, or we can work to align with our power. And control and power, like lust and love, look very similar. They're totally different things. And so, you know, don't waste a crisis is really about like, look, you can put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It's not going to do anything. You can fix this only to encounter it again a year from now in a different kind of way. You're just rebranding dysfunction. You know, you can break up with this terrible person you're dating, but if you don't, you know, align with your power, you're just going to date another terrible person with a different name and a different watch, you know? And so it's this moment of pause. But also in high functioning people, there is no crisis. So you have to be the one to fire the flare up into the sky and say, this is not the life I want to be leading. I don't even know what my values are anymore. I don't even know who I am. Whatever your existential stuff is, you have to speak that. And if you don't, it just eats you alive. And maladaptive perfectionism will come in to your mind in those moments and run the whole show.
Okay, I want to put a pin in maladaptive perfectionism, because when I read that in your book, I thought, oh boy, this is a sticking point. In fact, I really identified with one of the 5 types of perfectionists, and we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, okay, you set us up by talking about working with youth and then Wall Street and Google, and you notice this theme of connection or disconnection in people. What led to this aha moment for you regarding perfectionism then?
Well, once I came up through social work and kind of working with people doing crisis work and crisis management, I became really interested in what happens when people get everything they say they want and they're still not happy. And not just what happens, but like, how do they even know that? And what checks and balances are people putting into place to figure that out? Or are there any? And so that's why I started gravitating towards perfectionists and high achievers. And I mean, part of that is because I live in New York City, where this is like perfectionist mecca. Where it's like you can never get to the top. Everybody's always wanting to do more and be more, and it's just a density of ideas and energy, and you know, so it attracts a lot of people who want to pursue a lifetime of work that can never be done, which is like the perfectionist way.
Ooh, that's really interesting. Okay, if I could interject for a moment, then I'm just curious, because I live in the Midwest, so culture is just different. But it's super blue collar here, right? Is it a perfectionistic mecca, or is it people are, like we spoke of earlier, on this hamster wheel, this proverbial hamster wheel, wearing a mask, and the mask is an attempt to hide insecurities, shame narratives, fear, not just I have fear, but I am fundamentally, I am. This is a deep-seated belief statement. So the perfectionism drives, I have to achieve, I have to show up, I have to work 90 hours a week. And I have to move so quickly so that people don't see my fear, so that people don't see my shame, so that people don't see who I really am. Because if they really saw who I was, they would reject me for who I am. Is it a cover-up? What do you think? Like, what's underneath the hood of that?
You know, I'm so glad you brought up the sort of cultural difference, because I was in California when I started doing counseling work, and it's a different flavor of perfectionism in different places, but perfectionism is everywhere. And this is not a bad thing. In fact, this is a really good thing. And when I say perfectionists, this book is about flipping a paradigm on its head, which is this idea that we have that is not correct, that perfectionism equals bad. Now, perfectionism can be unhealthy and be all the things that you just said, a mask, a sort of like, let me distract you with all of my performance, and not just performance, achievement wise or career wise, but my performative way I'm going to appear and change my body, or my performative way I'm going to try to get the most amount of friends around me, whatever it is. Perfectionism at its core is a natural, healthy impulse that I believe all human beings feel. And I think that we have taken a really reductionist view of it, which is not how perfectionism started out in psychological literature, and that it's become this sort of shapeshifter in our culture. It's a very gendered term. There's a lot there, but I think we can start with the fact that perfectionism can show up in healthy ways and it can show up in unhealthy ways. And being a perfectionist is not a bad thing. Perfectionism is not your problem. The way you respond to your drive, whether you strive in healthy ways or unhealthy ways, and why you are striving. So it's like, what makes perfectionism healthy or unhealthy is to ask yourself two questions. How am I striving? And why am I striving? Which is exactly what you just said. Like, how am I striving in a way that's hurting me or exploiting other people or hurting other people? And why am I striving because I'm trying to prove something to everybody? Or am I striving because, I don't know what your personal life is like, obviously, but just from listening to your work, I can hear the intention in every episode. I can hear this desire in you to connect to all of these people and help them connect to themselves and each other. And I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is a part of you that really wants to grow and continue to grow. And it's not about saying, this isn't enough, I want more. It's not about greed. It's about saying, wow, look at this opportunity to reach more people. And of course I want to do that. And that's perfectionist energy. It's like, I could never, it's like if I told you, yes, you could have X amount of people and that's the cap. I think a part of you would be like, I don't want to cap it, but maybe not. In any case, how you're striving and why you're striving are the questions to ask yourself, not, am I a perfectionist or not?
Okay, this makes me curious then, and please correct me if I'm not hearing you correctly. How much of our identity then is connected to this drive? In other words, and maybe I could just associate it to what we'll talk about later, maladaptive perfectionism. If I am working, striving, achieving, and am ambitious in my life so that I can receive a sense of worth, value, and identity at the core of my being, that's exhausting. However, if I'm working from identity, and I'll just relate it to your very kind words about me in my podcast here, I, because of the losses of my life, have a maniacal drive to tell everyone I encounter, transformation and hope is possible for you. And transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens over many nights. Another way of saying it is like transformation doesn't happen in a day, it happens daily. I am maniacal about that, Katherine, because of the healing that has happened in my own life, and I want to share that with people. So, just to sum for folks joining us today, what I hear you saying is perfectionism, overextended and under stress, becomes a liability to us where we are now working for something that we already have. Exactly. Whereas in a healthy state, working from rest, working from true identity.
Yes, beautifully said.
Perfectionism is our ability to actually laser in, to focus, to harness. We're more precise. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the precision is not necessarily required, but I think, unless you mean like you're more focused, not
That's literal
precision. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I have a single eye. I am set on one voyage.
Yeah. I think that's beautifully said. And, that is a wonderful energy. Perfectionists are simply people who notice on a consistent basis, not just like a couple of times a week, but notice every day the gap between an ideal and a reality, and to feel actively compelled to bridge the gap. Like an idealist notices the ideal in reality, but is content dreaming about the ideal, right? And a high achiever notices the gap and can fill the gap, but can also stop and retire really young, say at 55, and call it a day and go chill on a beach somewhere and just kind of like do nothing and relax. Perfectionists would hate that. Like, that is the Sandy horror for perfectionists. Perfectionists love working. And I don't just mean in a professional context. And that's where some of the nuance and the 5 types of perfectionists and 5 kinds of perfectionism come in. And that's what I really want people to connect to, is that perfectionism is a natural human impulse. And, you know, I call people perfectionists who encounter that impulse in a patterned way. But everybody encounters this sense that, like, I see the ideal and I want that. And I want to do something to make me closer to that. And we have to be careful about how we do that and why we do that. Otherwise, you know, we can run a risk of becoming depressed or more anxious. And you can also increase your joy and connection if you know why and how you're doing that, and you do it in a way that's value-driven and intentional.
Yeah, I'm so thankful for this conversation, because not only is it a topic of interest for me, but you're a professional, you're a therapist, and so I love the angle that you can afford us in this conversation. I think to be truly value-adding for folks, it makes me curious, Katherine, and you tipped your hat to this in your book, and the question is simply this then: what really drives perfectionism? I know a lot of people say, oh, I'm a recovering perfectionist. In fact, in your book, you say, like, getting rid of your perfectionism isn't going to stop you from becoming being a perfectionist. So what drives it, though? Is that the need to avoid average and the status quo? Like, what's the motivator?
It's a really good question. And I think perfectionism, what we're learning about this construct is that it's so kaleidoscopic, and it's also unfurls itself in really individual ways. You know, the bare basics and bones of that question is goes back to the top of our conversation. Like, a sense of disconnection drives maladaptive perfectionism, and a sense of deep connection drives adaptive, the healthy kind of perfectionism. Saying I'm a recovering perfectionist drives me nuts. And hearing that, I always want to stop people and say, like, what are you trying to recover from? Because being a perfectionist is like being a romantic or being an activist. It's like an enduring identity marker. And the research backs this up, that people who identify with being a perfectionist identify with that throughout the course of their whole life. And so you don't tell someone who's a romantic, just don't believe in love so much. And you don't tell someone who's an activist, listen, you need to just dial down the caring about the world and things a little more. You tell them, look, if you want to believe in love, believe in it. It's beautiful. The world needs all kinds of people. You should be your full self. But do you know what boundaries are?
Yeah,
you know, do
right.
you know like what's okay with you and not? And same with activists. It's like, do you know what burnout is? Do you know what community is? Do you know what all these things are? Because if you don't have that stuff around your identity, it's going to get dangerous for you. And perfectionists are the same way. It's like, you can be a perfectionist, go for it. It's beautiful. It's just like being, you know, a romantic or an activist, but you got to also know like where the landmines are.
Yeah. So this is interesting then, because we are really unfurling this topic of identity. And I want to ask you the question you've been asking yourself, and this was straight from your book, and I found it fascinating. Yeah. What do people mean when they say, I'm a perfectionist? Like, what have you learned in your research?
Oh, I've been so obsessed with that question.
Yeah, tell me more.
You know, I hear people say that a lot, and there is kind of like the colloquial definition of that and I think it's sometimes used by people to describe themselves, is a perfectionist is someone who wants all things to be perfect at all times. And we all know that's not true. That's an oversimplification. So when someone calls themselves a perfectionist, I always wonder, what are you trying to signal to me? That you care? It's often, I care about this thing. I have a value here, right? I want to do a good job. And I think people are also trying to signal, like, I have some neuroses, but they're good. Like, I'm going to use them for good. And so I think people, we don't know what it means really to be a perfectionist, or what perfectionism means, because these aren't clinical terms, right? You can't be diagnosed with perfectionism.
Right.
That's, and so we all just kind of, like, throw it against the wall sometimes. But I think the biggest signal that I get is, like, I care about this.
I love
and
that.
This can be the project, or this can be, I care about you as a manager, thinking I'm a valuable employee. That's why I don't like recovering perfectionist, because there's nothing you need to recover from. There's nothing about who you are that you need to recover from. Healing is not about eradicating a part of yourself that you don't think is good. Healing is about integrating all the parts into one whole self. We all have parts that get messy and complicated. That's called being a human. And so, I don't subscribe to this, like, perfectionism is bad, be a recovering perfectionist, any of that at all. This isn't about like New Yorkie high striver, whatever. Right. I think high strivers exist everywhere. I grew up in North Carolina.
Yeah, you're looking at one. And,
surrounded by a lot of perfectionism, a lot of perfectionists, in good ways, obviously, and also in some ways that were challenging. And I just want to go to the 5 types, because I really want people to get that perfectionism is not just about, I want the fanciest title or the highest paying job. It can show up emotionally, relationally, interpersonally. So would it be okay if I went through those 5 types real quick?
I would love that. And I'll even just say, as a precursor to that, when I read about the intense perfectionist, I was like, I think that's me, but we'll see. So go ahead and take us into the 5, and then actually I have some back end questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is such a fun conversation, by the way. I love this. Okay, so perfectionism is not this little ring box of a concept where we're like, oh, I want everything to be perfect at all times. Perfectionists are smart people. We get it. Perfectionism unfurls itself in all kinds of ways. So the 5 ways that I identified from my work were: 1, classic perfectionists. And this is the typical highly organized itinerary for vacation, very reliable, add structure to everywhere they go person. Messy perfectionist. So a messy perfectionist is someone who's in love with and good at the beginning of something. They're starting a million projects. They have a flood of ideas. They're just super idea generators. And they want the middle of the process to be perfect. So it starts out feeling perfect and romanticized, and then you get into the tedium, and they have trouble kind of moving past that, the like logistical, sort of more boring aspects of relationships or jobs or whatever it is. Procrastinator perfectionists want the beginning to be perfect. And so they're kind of the counterpart to messy perfectionists in a way, where procrastinator perfectionists can thrive in the middle and towards the end of any goal, but they struggle in the beginning because they don't feel perfectly ready. They're not sure they understand it perfectly, so there's some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Then there's Parisian perfectionists who want to be perfectly liked. And their perfectionism shows up interpersonally. So they could have like a, average 9 to 5, whatever kind of job, but they want their connections to feel like the ideal, their connections to themselves or their kids or their partner or their family. And when they don't match the ideal, it's really hard for that type of perfectionist. And the last one is intense perfectionists. And that's those are people who are highly invested in an outcome. And they're really focused and visionary, and they want something badly. And they are going to do what they need to do to get it. And so, I can see that in terms of everything you said about the loss that you've suffered and how that spurred in you this insatiable drive to kind of shoulder shake everybody and say, life is now and you can heal and nothing's dictated by the past and you are free, freer than you think. And all these messages that I've heard you say match the intense perfectionist. So intense perfectionism can also obviously, as all of these can, go in the wrong direction, meaning, you can use it to hurt yourself or others.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we could stay there for a moment. And I'm so thankful for what you're sharing, Katherine. I'm just so grateful for the intentionality that you're taking this information and just your story. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate you for it.
Thank you.
I think about, even through my own story, what the intensity, the drive to say to people today.
Yeah.
Brokenness may have happened to you, but broken is not who you are. I think about that as a simple example. What that required of me to move through that process of transformation was a willingness to let go of intensity, some areas of perfectionism where I said, okay, I'm willing to step into mess. I'm willing to reluctantly allow pain to happen again. After we all experience pain and loss, there's this neurobiological motivation to insulate and isolate and say, I don't like how that felt. I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen again. And what I found in my own life is that change hurts, healing's costly. And really this journey to wholeness is flat out expensive, but the payout has been remarkable in terms of my own growth. And what it has done on the other side is it has catalyzed even greater connection with those people who are closest to me. It has caused me to have a sharper sense of purpose for my life. And I hope it does the same for others. So folks, I want you to just sort of reflect here upon what Katherine has so eloquently shared with us today, because I want you to perhaps look at your own life right now and say, what's this drive? What's this drive? Where can I actually hone these passions and drives and desires that I have to be more effective for the people who matter most and the things that I have on my heart to do? So,
yeah.
Katherine, I think about one thing, though, in regards to this, and again, it's why I'm thankful you're a therapist, because I think about perfectionism and anxiety, and perhaps the role anxiety plays in this conversation. I think when I was little, people could have said, oh, Chris, you're neurotic. Okay, whatever. So does an innate anxious personality fuel and give wings to perfectionism? Or does perfectionism, overextended and under stress, catalyze anxiety? Or, you're the therapist, neither.
I would say neither.
Okay, tell me more.
I think anxiety is a natural human experience. And so when I use this book is filled with reframes, new ways to use language to help you change the way that you think. So the example that I used in the book is about asking for help. And a lot of people think of asking for help as a failure, meaning they can't do something on their own, they're not strong enough,
Yes.
they're weak, whatever. But if you reframe that into saying asking for help is a refusal to give up, then that makes people feel stronger, empowered. You know, they have personal agency, which is all true about asking for help. And, you know, there's 25 of these in the book, and the main one is perfectionism. But if you notice, I low-key weaved in a secret one, which is I used the phrase excess anxiety a lot in the book. Because when someone says to me, I have anxiety, I'm like, yeah, you're a human being. You know, that's like hearing someone say, I have thoughts. And it's not whether you have anxiety or not. It's, you know, in the same way it's not whether you have a thought or not. It's like, is the thought predominantly negative? Are they intrusive thoughts? You know, and so the anxiety is just a signal that like you have a lot of energy and you got to find a way to channel that energy. And to do that in a healthy way, you need to understand what your values are. And I have a value list in the book because I think a lot of people don't know what their values are because we don't really emphasize emotional intelligence that much in our public school system. And so
you're right about
we're
that.
adults
Yeah.
before we ever even encounter this sense of like what a boundary means or what your values are. We just don't really enter that terrain. And then we're doing it on our own. And I know that it's hard for a lot of people. It's been really hard for me to have to do kind of this independent study work, which I did a lot of my 20s and continue to do. Podcasts are a big save for me because they're just like a continual source of connection and reinforcement of these new ideas. That's what I think can be tricky is like you can hear someone like you or me or read a book or do whatever. But if you don't have that message reinforced in your relationships and in the other pieces of your life, it just kind of like shrinks itself. It's like trying to grow a plant in the dark. And so you know, I don't know if I answered your question or what your question was, but I don't think perfectionism and anxiety are automatically correlated. And I don't think anxiety is a bad thing in the first place.
Right. It's an alarm. A friend of mine, he's a clinical psychologist in the Nashville area, says exactly what you said. It's an alarm. It says, hey, just pay attention to something. There's smoke, there's fire, you know?
Yeah, maybe even like a ringing bell.
That's it.
Just like, bell can sound nice, but if you don't do anything with it and it stays on, it's annoying, you know, and it's going to drive you nuts. But yeah, an alarm works too, but an alarm is inherently more like, how do you turn that thing off? And yeah, I have a lot of anxiety that if I don't do something with it every single day, it doesn't work out well for me. And so, you know, I don't think that makes me bad or unhealthy or, you know, unwell. It's just that's how human beings are.
Yeah. How does shame then infiltrate this conversation around perfectionism? And perhaps it would latch on to the classic perfectionist, the messy perfectionist, the intense perfectionist, the Parisian perfectionist, and the procrastinator perfectionist in different ways. But, you know, shame has been such a dominant conversation piece in the last, 30 years when I think about people like John Bradshaw. But then, of course, you know, the likes of Brene Brown have brought it to the masses in the last 10 years or so. Yeah. How does shame infiltrate, from your perspective as a professional therapist, how does shame infiltrate this conversation around perfectionism? And then what happens when it does?
Yeah. I mean, shame is the primary driver of maladaptive perfectionism.
Can you define that actually before we move on?
Sure.
I would love to. We've said that a few times, and I'd love to kind of
maladaptive perfectionism.
Yeah.
So that's basically when you use your perfectionism to that impulse inside of you that's telling you there's more you have to do about this, and you got to get closer to the ideal. When you use that to help you and heal you, that's adaptive perfectionism. And when you use it to hurt you or hurt others, that's maladaptive perfectionism. And to kind of define shame, Dr. Brené Brown defines it this way, and I think it's really brilliant, and all therapists basically agree on this, which is that guilt says, I'm sorry about what I did, and shame says, I'm sorry about who I am. And so shame drives maladaptive perfectionism, and particularly if you experience shame as a kid, mainly the shame of not knowing if you're loved, not having that connection, not knowing if you're safe. You are fighting against trying to not let people see that who you are is bad. So you go into hiding, and you hide through performative measures by trying to be a people pleaser, Parisian perfectionist, get everyone to like you, by trying to be an intense perfectionist and like make the next unicorn startup, whatever, in all these different ways. So shame, anytime shame is in the room, a bunch of other bad stuff is in there too, including maladaptive iterations of perfectionism.
Wow.
Including a ton of disconnection. But to your point, and the theme of this work that you do, connection to another person or to your own value, to yourself, that makes all of this so much smaller. Nothing makes your past go away or the undesirable feelings that you have disappear. But when you invite real connection into your life, that's the greatest predictor of mental health, is relational wealth, as Dr. Perry's research shows. And that's so empowering to me. Like, that's a core message of this book. It's like, it doesn't matter what happened to you. It doesn't matter what's happening right now. You can change it. And there's, 6 different types of help in here, and how to ask for help and how to give help, because connection is also being able to accept your full whole self and accept that you have things to give too, and an exchange of that. That's what connection is. It's not just one-sided. That's impossible. That's not connection. That's transaction.
I want to go back to what you were saying about shame, because I think it's important for us to get a hold of what is it about shame that is so insidious that when it hooks itself to us at an early age, it tends to write a narrative for us that is, dare I say, permanent without some key awareness, key presence, and really commitment to pursue healing. What is it about shame that is so insidious?
Well, it's a fear-based experience, and fear is a powerful driver. And when you're a kid, you have no power. You don't have any agency. And so this sense that your parents or caregivers are just there to like show you who you are and help you to feel brave and find yourself. They're also the people that are giving you food and shelter and survival like stuff. And so when that primal attachment is not secure, that fear becomes consuming. And to your point about treading along the word permanent, let's just go there and say, even if that is permanent, that doesn't mean you can't also invite something else into the room. It's like learning another language. If you grew up feeling a lot of shame for any reason, you grew up speaking the language of disconnection. That doesn't mean you can't learn a new language. Now, you're always going to hear and know the whole alphabet and all the letters and whatever else in the other language, your primary language. Who cares? That doesn't matter. That doesn't dictate how you choose to speak and show up. Now, learning a new language is not easy. It takes time. You have to be around people who speak the language of connection fluently, or you're never going to get it. But you can do it. People learn new languages all the time. And I think that's really an exciting part of reframing how we think about things. Is like, instead of this fear of like, am I damaged for life? It's like 2 things, 3 things, 4 things can exist alongside of each other. Our minds are so spacious. Our hearts are so spacious. Our souls are eternally spacious. We don't have to pick one, So your fate's not sealed. It's so exciting. It's like but you do have to learn tools, and you have to get around people who are also invested in changing their narratives,
You wrote in your book, quote, "The compulsive and active quality of perfectionism is what separates idealists and high strivers from perfectionists." Teach that out. I'm super curious.
So there's an active quality to perfectionism, and that it differentiates it from being a high striver, in that high strivers can stop striving and be good with that. But perfectionists really can't. These are the people that they can retire or not, or they can, if we're extending perfectionism outside of just professional manifestations, they will always, for their whole life, want to chase the ideal. They're never going to stop. And good, because it'll be a beautiful life. And so that's the difference between perfectionists and high strivers. And perfectionists and idealists are like, idealists can daydream, and they're so happy to daydream. But perfectionists, don't want to daydream. They're not interested in that. They're interested in activating the dream. And everybody is important. Everybody plays different roles. If we were all, scrambling to change everything all at once, there would be so much chaos. Like, I need people who are just dreamers in my life. They need me. That's why we all need each other, because we're all different, and we are all, so I don't want anyone to hear this and say, oh, perfectionists are better, or high strivers are better, or idealists are better. There is no better or worse. They're just different,
Yes.
So.
Yes. Okay, well then to that, if we turn the page, many people conflate OCD with perfectionism.
Yeah.
Now, this is super curious to me because last month on the podcast, I had a neurosurgeon from University of Penn on to talk exactly about this, compulsive behaviors, including OCD. But I want to hear about this from a therapy perspective.
Right. So obsessive compulsive disorder is, first of all, a disorder, and perfectionism is not a clinically recognized disorder. And so the way I'm conceptualizing perfectionism and all of its iterations is just a world away from OCD, which is characterized by obsessive thoughts about, usually around a certain theme, like contamination or harm. I'm going to get sick because I'm, going to get some germ, or I'm going to accidentally hurt someone that I love. Or these thoughts that don't feel like one's own. They're intrusive in a way. And the compulsion is designed to kind of temper the thoughts. It's the way that the person is trying to manage this flood of obsessional thoughts. And so it's like, well, if I tap this 4 times, if I tap this door frame 4 times, then I'm thinking about tapping a door frame 4 times, and I'm not thinking about, whether I'm going to accidentally hurt someone, And so that's what that's about. And that's a very different thing than having an ideal and wanting to take, intense energy within yourself and try to reach that ideal. And, they're worlds apart, those two. Though, if we want to get into the weeds, there is a clinically recognized trait called rigid perfectionism, which can present in OCD. And that's kind of the type of perfectionism I think most people have in their minds, of like everything must be in a row, organized perfectly, done perfectly. And the DSM, that big book that has all the disorders in it, is making a real distinction when they put the word rigid in front of there, because what they're signaling is that perfectionism can be rigid or flexible. It can be healthy or unhealthy. So when perfectionism is rigid to an extreme degree, then it becomes associated with some of these mental health disorders like OCD.
Got it. Well, let's go back to, again, to reference the 5 types of perfectionists. And each perfectionist tends to stick to their go-to self-punishment themes. I was really fascinated by this. Those are your words. In fact, I want to first ask what role self-punishment plays in perfectionistic behavior, and then let's take a few moments to identify the themes of each perfectionist type.
Yeah. So punishment, I think, is the number one problem in terms of generating mental illness. And not just mental illness in terms of like categorical mental illness like depression or OCD, but I mean mental unwellness, right? So like increased feelings of depression or increased excess anxiety. And I have a whole chapter in the Perfectionist Guide to Losing Control about how punishment does not work. And we think punishment works. And we think we're being disciplined when we're hard on ourselves or other people around us. And we're just doing the opposite of what works, which is self-compassion. And so the 5 types all have their own way of punishing themselves. But this is all context-driven and fluid. So these are kind of general patterns, but anybody can, negative self-talk, for example, is a common form of punishment when you speak harshly to yourself. And that's not, connected to one specific type necessarily. But procrastinator perfectionists typically ruminate as punishment. So they just think over and over again about...
That's me.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, about like what they should be starting. They haven't started yet. Like
What
they're
might happen?
bad. What's that?
What might happen if I don't?
Yeah. Yeah. And so we mistake rumination for reflection. And that's when thinking about it becomes unproductive. You're not really reflecting. Reflecting asks thoughtful questions like, what is the problem here? What are some solutions? I was reading an article that you wrote earlier today, and it said, what is the biggest frustration in your life? That's a great question. Those aren't ruminating questions. Those are reflection questions.
Got it.
And so ruminating is just going over the same unhelpful thoughts. And they're often like, I can't believe I did that. That was so dumb. I got to never do that again. I can't believe I did that. It's like not really fruitful. So that's one. And each type kind of has their own. Intense perfectionists punish themselves through interpersonal turmoil. So they will disregard the relationships in their life to get the outcome of whatever they're trying to do, and kind of take this approach of like, I'll play with my kids later. I'll deal with that later. I'll, do that later. And then their relationships in their lives really suffer. And Parisian perfectionists people please at the expense of taking care of themselves and pleasing themselves. Messy perfectionists have arrested development. Like when they're being punitive with themselves, they don't allow their dreams to develop. And that's painful for a messy perfectionist, because until you can get a handle on that, you're starting a million things and not finishing anything, and you feel like such a failure. And then you get these negative identity scripts in your mind of like, I can never follow through on anything. I'm not organized enough. No one takes me seriously enough. And it's just like a really bad cycle. And there's all these different ways of punishing themselves. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would just implant in every person's brain that punishment doesn't work. Punishment is not the same as discipline. It's not the same as personal accountability. It's not the same as rehabilitation. It's just this useless, lazy, terrible thing that creates more pain. That's the point of punishment, is just how can I create more pain for this person? And often the person is ourselves. And self-compassion, which is the opposite of punishment, is not being like overly polite to yourself. People really don't want to use self-compassion because they think it's like letting themselves off the hook. It's actually a 3-step resiliency building skill that is probably the most powerful tool if you're feeling stuck to use. But if you don't know that it's a 3-step resiliency building skill, and why would you? Because again, we're all emotionally illiterate. We don't talk about this stuff in schools. You're just like, okay, I guess I'll try to say nice things to myself. You don't believe it. It doesn't work. And you just go back to punishing yourself because that's what you think is gonna like rattle you and get you, on some right track, So I really hope that message comes through in the book, that punishment doesn't work. Only self-compassion works. And if you don't choose self-compassion, everything else is a punishment.
It seems like on the other side of the equation of these go-to self-punishment themes is unintentional self-sabotage then. And how many people are unintentionally sabotaging their futures, their potential, by staying trapped in these self-punishment cycles. What do you think about that?
I think I'm really glad you brought that up. When I first heard the phrase self-sabotage, I was like, oh my God, I've been doing that my whole life. I work and work and work so hard for something. And then I don't know how old I was. It was like 23, maybe 24. Like I work so hard at something and then I mess it up at the last second, or I don't allow myself enough self-care to actually enjoy it in a sustainable way. Or I just work at developing all these skills and then I, blow them up in some way. And I think self-sabotage is something that we all have to face. And the thing about these pieces, punishment and self-sabotage, is that they're not literal. So they show up in these really insidious, sneaky ways. And so we think like, oh, I'm not self-sabotaging, I'm celebrating. That's why I'm going out and drinking and having a great time before my first day of work. And then you get to your job and you can't even, hold it together. Like, it's not like we're taking some weapon and like actually literally hurting ourselves. We're doing it in these really subtle ways. And so bringing awareness to what those ways are is how you connect to your power. And seeing the examples of the client stories that I tell in the book, which, are fictionalized because they're not my real client stories are not my stories to tell. But I think it really helps people, or I hope it will, to be able to see themselves in those kinds of subtle punishments. Like one example I gave was this woman who got in a fight with her mom on the phone and hung up on her mom and felt really bad and apologized, and her mom was fine about it and they kind of moved on, or so her mom thought. But the woman who had made the mistake of hanging up and kind of let her impulse get the best of her, then proceeded to punish herself for the rest of the day by like drinking more coffee when she knows that she doesn't need more coffee, and like not listening to music on her commute because she was going to reflect on why she needs to be a better daughter. It's like people feel that that unless they feel miserable, they're not really sorry or they're not really accountable. And you do not need to be a miserable, suffering person to be someone who's very accountable, who can show up, who you can trust to show up in the first place, and who you can also trust to show up when they make a misstep. You know, that has nothing to do with misery. You can be joyful. You know, if that woman were to have listened to fun music and had a good time on her commute to work, that doesn't mean she's not sorry or that she doesn't recognize the error
Right.
that she made, you know?
Landing the plane on this conversation, which has been so rich, I'd love to frame up some perspective shifts for folks today, Katherine. You list several in the book, and I just pulled out a few that I'd love to double click on. The first is this: counterfactual thinking is a cognitive reflex. What's that all about? Is that a survival motivation?
So this is something that is extraordinarily unique. It's something only human beings do. And our minds have the capacity to see the reality, but also imagine a different reality. So counterfactual thinking is when you see the kind of facts. You and I are on a podcast right now, and then you encounter a factual thought, which is a thought that counters the fact, which is like, well, we could have not been on this podcast. And when you do something and you make a mistake, everybody experiences the counterfactual thought of, I could have not made that mistake. And what you do next after your reflexive counterfactual thought will point you in the direction of either recovering from your mistake, learning, growing, thriving, or doing what we've been talking about, which is really lodging yourself in shame and a cycle of punishment and contracting instead of expanding.
Well, let's take a couple more then. You tell us to swap better or worse for different.
So if someone doesn't have the same values that you have, then comparing that person to you doesn't make any sense, because it's like, well, yeah, they may have more money, but I don't value money as much as I value the opportunity to have time with this person or whatever it is. And you also can't compare yourself because you really never know what's going on behind closed doors. So that section is about just the futility of comparison. And it's been a blessing of my work that message is so ingrained in me, because I see people who have everything, who you would never, ever imagine are struggling at all, let alone as much as they are. And it's like, you know, therapists see that every day. So I understand you really do not know, no matter how well someone can present, what is happening behind closed doors.
That sort of leads to this one. Happiness is experienced in 3 stages. So is stress. What's that about?
Yeah, so this is a really good one. This is about understanding the utility of an experience. So we tend to make decisions about whether we do or do not want to do something based on the event itself, like going out to dinner. Do I want to go to dinner or do I not want to? And we think that is where we're going to experience all of our satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And that's not true. So the anticipation to the event, you can extract a lot of excitement or, you know, excess anxiety from that. And the recalling of the event, you can also experience a lot of negative or positive emotion. So it's about making decisions based on all 3 factors. So when you say to somebody like, oh, let's just get a quick coffee, it'll just be 20 minutes. No, it's not going to be 20 minutes. It's going to be, because a lot of people do stuff with people.
Oh, this is huge.
Or they do things that they don't really want to do.
Exactly.
And they minimize it by saying it's just 20 minutes or it's just this. But it's the week leading up to that where you're like, oh, I have to do that thing. And then it's the week after where you're like, I can't believe I wasted my time. That was so annoying. I wish I would have done this. Now I'm behind on that, all this stuff. And so it's really being able to utilize that. It's called the AER model.
Yeah.
Anticipation, event, recall. And I cite the researchers and everything who created that model in my book. They're brilliant. And it's about using that to give yourself a little more permission to say no to the stuff you do not want to do, because it lasts longer than the time you're committing to doing it. And it gives yourself agency to say yes to the things you do want to do. And also the awareness that just because an event ended doesn't mean you can't extract so much pleasure from it. You know, there was this TED Talk by the famed psychologist, Dr. Danny Kahneman, and he presented this question of what kind of vacation would you plan if you would have no memory of that vacation? And it's like, oh, I don't know. And then we realize how powerful recall is. That's the R of the AER model. Like, recall is a powerful source of well-being, recalling wonderful moments, recalling great connective conversation. And we can do things in our life to increase our recall, like frame photos or, you know, tell stories about the, you know, moments that mattered to us. And so that's another, you know, point of power.
It's amazing what you said, because I'm thinking through the wraparound of this entire conversation, and we're back to a couple concepts, and it is really the preeminence of identity and boundaries. Because when we have a healthy sense of identity, when we have boundaries in our life, we can really go after the things that are going to matter most for our present, for our future, without regret. And I'm just really fascinated how all of these themes tie into this conversation around perfectionism. But that leads me to, I'd say, my favorite one of these maxims, because it's been a point of interest for me for a while, and that is that energy management beats time management. Tell me more.
So that is from a brilliant article I read in the Harvard Business Review about how it's not that we don't have the time to do things, it's that we don't have the energy. And, you know, I really want to have such a bigger conversation about this. I have to go in a moment, which I'm so annoyed by.
Let's do it again if you want, because I'd love to have that conversation.
Do it, because that energy management over time management is a whole unlock to reframing productivity and what it means to be productive. Productivity, it's a real reductionist view to say it's about task completion. No, it's not. It's about, can you bring premium energy to what you're doing? Because premium energy you, 1 hour of premium energy you is going to get a higher quality product, whether that's an actual product or it's like a conversation or whatever it is, a higher quality experience than like 10-hour burnt out you, resentful you, low energy you could ever even do, you know? And so when you manage your energy instead of your time, you completely get in a new mindset, a very liberating mindset about that also gives you permission to do important core things like rest, like say no to people and things that drain your energy. You know, it really impacts your quality of life when you are hemorrhaging energy, you know, trying to make the most out of situations that you really need to extract from or create some serious boundaries around.
Katherine, I can't thank you enough for this conversation today and just your wisdom that you've shared. And I've so enjoyed my time with you today. Is there anything else you want to leave with the listeners?
Well, I just want to thank you too. This was so energizing and invigorating.
I'm so glad.
And I'm
Thank
such
you
a
for saying
fan.
that.
And so it's been really wonderful to
Katherine.
dive into your work. It's very inspiring. And I thank
You're
you
so
so much. You've truly gained a listener here because
you're so
you
kind.
cover the whole gamut too. It's not just one thing.
Thank you.
It's pretty extraordinary.
I'm so thankful for that.
To leave listeners with, you know, The Perfectionist Guide to Losing Control, my book, is about so much more than perfectionism. It's about the universal impulse that we all do at grasping at control. When we're sitting on a pile of power, and when you're living your life trying to, get control instead of accessing your power, it's tantamount to pushing a car from the bumper instead of getting inside and driving it. And this book has, I tried my best to put 2 years of therapy into a book. Therapy and book, reading a book by a therapist, not the same thing, but I really put a lot into this, and I hope that that is felt. And if I could wish anything for readers to feel upon closing this book, it would be a deeper sense of connection, which I think the book offers. And so if you're feeling disconnected or discombobulated or just like, you don't really know what's what, I'd really like to offer you this book to read, and I hope you enjoy it.
So good. Well, folks, head to the show notes now at wintoday.tv. I'll put a link within to get a copy of Katherine's book. You can watch this conversation there. But Katherine, I'm so thankful. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. My complete pleasure.
Let's put a
I hope
pin.
I talk to you again soon.
Oh my gosh, I was going to say, let's put a pin in this, and you now have a public invitation back. Let's put a pin in that, because I'd love to have a full conversation around energy management with you, but we can talk about that offline. Thanks for being here.
Okay, my pleasure. Take care.